Hello, everyone. My name is Rich Bina. I am a strategic planning director at RPA. My co-presenter is Dr. Carl Marci. He is Nielsen's chief neuroscientist. We are your lunchtime entertainment. So, what are we going to talk about today? You know, it's funny, earlier on the creative director track, we talked a lot about how the creative process can be an introverted one. But then at the end of the day, creativity is largely about collaboration, right? You have clients, you have other people at your agency, you have producers, everybody who will have a part in that creative process, right? And that's great. You know, that we always talk about collaboration fuels creativity, right? Or at least that's the way it always comes out when we write the case study. And when we talk amongst ourselves, it can be messy. And when you're at home and you're looking in the mirror and you find a premature gray hair, you may think of some of your collaborators who may come to mind. And that's the reality, that, you know, collaboration, when people come to the creative process, right, nobody comes with a blank slate. Everybody brings something, and sometimes we call that wisdom, sometimes we call it baggage, and today we're going to talk about it as bias. And we're not going to talk about it as much in terms of gender and ethnicity and other types of bias. We're going to talk about it a little bit more of your sort of learned and innate bias, or your sort of learned biases that you bring from all your years of experience. And Carl will talk about that in a little bit of detail. So what we're going to talk about today and what we're going to show you, so you know, right, that creativity and collaboration can be messy. I'm not telling you anything new, you're creative directors, right? You've lived through this every single day. Every time you get the crazy piece of feedback that seems completely at odds with the objective of your project, right? You think, what the heck is going on? And you know that there are other things at work. What doesn't happen is you don't get to see it come to life on the big screen. And that's what we're going to do today. But first, Carl's going to take you through a little bit of a background of bias from a neuroscience perspective and what we're talking about. Then we'll dive into a study we did and kind of bring everything to life. And we'll talk about mitigating it a little bit towards the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carl.
Good afternoon. So thanks, Rich, and thanks to the organizers of 3% for inviting us. I'm going to start off a little bit with a definition, right? So we've all probably heard a lot about bias in the news, but rarely do people actually define it. So let's first start with a definition, right? So bias is prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way that's considered unfair. And today we're going to focus more on some things, as well as, by way of background, some people. And I want to make a distinction between learned biases and innate biases. So a learned bias is something, obviously, that we aren't born with, but that we acquire through knowledge and learning in our environment. And it's interesting that race we now think of as a learned bias. So it turns out if you take 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and you have black-skinned people and white-skinned people offer them a toy, they will choose randomly about half and half from the black and the white person presenting that toy. At around the age 4 and 5, they start to discriminate and choose the toy preferentially from a person who has the same skin color. So this is becoming something that we think of as a learned bias. But there are also these innate biases. And sometimes those are a little bit easier to understand, and thinking about where they come from an evolutionary perspective, I think starts to frame the issue quite well. So I'm going to walk you through 3 innate biases as examples of how bias works, and then talk a little bit about the brain. So the first one is going to be judgments about gender. The second one is going to be judgments from our visual system. And then the third one, which starts to begin to come a little closer to home for the folks in this conference, is judgments and intuitions about communications. So let's start with a fun one. I know you're eating, but if you can indulge me, how many people think the face on the left is a male? And how many think the face on the left is a female? Okay. And on the right, how many people think the face is a male? Wait, you said male for both of them. And how many think the face on the right is a female? Okay, so you're all wrong because it's actually the same face. And the only difference between these two images is the amount of contrast. But you're all right in a sense that the majority of you picked the one on the left as female. We know that judgments of gender from the face tend to be biased by contrast. So the more contrast there is, the more likely we are to see that person as a female. The less contrast, the more likely we are to see that person as a male. It's thought to be part of the reason why women wear makeup, to enhance contrast. And it's also thought that this probably evolved as an innate bias for evolutionary reasons. You can imagine, in the savannah or as we evolved as early hominins and hominids, knowing which gender you were approaching, if you wanted to be friendly or not, was actually important. So let's move on to a second one. This is the visual system. So how many people think A and B are the same color? Okay. This guy just raises his hand all the time. So it turns out they are the same color. And so this is what's known as a context effect. It's also playing on contrast, but when the brain sees different color shades, it's highly dependent on what that color is next to, and that will send a signal to the brain of what's going on. And again, you can imagine from an evolutionary perspective, understanding subtleties in contrast was really important, particularly for night vision. So we err on the side of seeing differences rather than similarities, so we can make judgments about our environment. And this one is sort of an easy one. How many people think the guy in the front is smaller than the guy in the back? Okay, let's take a look. And it turns out they're the same size, right? So this is a perspective bias. We are innately biased to see things that are in the foreground as closer, things that are in the background as further away. Again, from an evolutionary perspective, you might imagine this evolved so that if there's a threat in your environment, you wouldn't want to be wrong about how far away they are. So we're going to err on the side of thinking that that's closer. Okay, so those are just some examples of bias that are in the brain. And the way we think about this from a neuroscience perspective is to use a simple rider and elephant metaphor. So the human brain has between 80 and 100 billion neurons, each one making between 10 and 20,000 connections. It is thought to be one of the most complex entities in the known universe. And what's really cool is you all have one. And I make very few guarantees, but I guarantee that the brain you walked in with today is not the brain you're going to leave with. Why? Because as we are presenting information and showing you these slides, you're going to be paying attention, you're going to be generating an emotional response, and some of that information is going to go into your memory system. But one of the things we've learned about the brain in the last few decades is an awful lot of brain processing is happening below conscious awareness. And those biases I just walked you through are judgments that are being made without your conscious brain contributing to it. And so the metaphor here is that the conscious part of our brain is the rider, who's actually trying to make decisions and guide that elephant. But the reality is there's an awful lot going on that's being driven by the elephant. And we need to understand when we're talking to the rider and when we're talking to the elephant in order to understand bias.
My personal favorite part of this is the fact that Buddhism figured this out like centuries ago, and we're now just sort of catching up with some science.
That's right. So I'm going to give you one last example here that moves, again, closer to sort of how we process information. The petrified forest, one of our national parks, is a national treasure. However, they have a problem, and that is people tend to pick up little pieces of petrified wood as souvenirs. And if people keep doing that, then there's not going to be much left. So the folks at the national forest decided to put up a sign. And that sign said, your heritage is being vandalized every day by theft with losses of petrified wood of 14 tons a year, mostly a small piece at a time. Now, at the surface, this sign makes sense, right? Describe the problem, say that it's actually not something we want to have happen. This is a national treasure, so invoke the connection to the nation and what value that has, and then try to discourage people from doing that. Well, a number of years ago, a social scientist saw this and was horrified. And that social scientist was studying what's now called the norms bias. And a norms bias is when we actually project a norm through a communication that's designed to convince people to do one thing, but it actually communicates the other. And so he actually convinced the National Forest to do an experiment. And he hired a bunch of graduate students to literally go through the park and count every single piece of petrified wood they could find. And that allowed them, at the end of a week, to tell how many pieces people took away. And then they changed the signs.
Let this be a warning to you for anybody who's thinking about going back to school.
It's a tough task. So there are 3 conditions, okay? So the first one is our baseline condition. So this is the sign I just showed you, and on average, people were taking about 3% of the pieces of wood along their path. They then created 2 additional signs. And the top one is the one where no norm is triggered. It says, please don't remove the petrified wood from the park in order to preserve the natural state of the petrified forest. And when they posted that sign, the percentage of pieces actually dropped. And then they created one where they're actually really trying to trigger the social norm in a significant way. And this is, many past visitors have removed petrified wood from the park, changing the natural state of the petrified forest. So you're literally saying everybody does this. And what happens is you skyrocket in the percentage of people doing it. So understanding this when you're communicating or trying to change behavior is really important. And you can see just through these 2 examples that the science hasn't actually communicated or been translated to folks who are making some campaigns. So for example, in California, we found this. Did you know that cigarette butts are the most commonly littered item? Right? So what do you think that does for triggering norms? People are going to just throw it down. And then even worse, an anti-piracy campaign by the US government says in Somalia, over 60% of young males are involved in piracy. Help us to keep your young boys safe by steering them away from piracy, right? So you're projecting a norm. Wow, a lot of people are doing this. It's normal, therefore it's okay. And so going back to our rider and elephant, these norms and these communications that are projecting the norm are really talking to the elephant. And the norm is thought to have evolved because we want to be part of the group, because we think groups actually make, on average, better decisions. And so if you're evolving and you see a water hole where no one's drinking from, and you see a water hole where everybody's drinking from, you're probably going to drink the water from the one everyone else is drinking from. So over time, we can see how some of these things have evolved. But of course, we don't live in the past. We live in the present.
And so sometimes we carry those biases with us. So the current state of American public discourse, the subconscious let go. We talk about, sometimes you can have that battle. Probably the more apt analogy is this one. So there's an elephant hidden here, right? But you can't see it. And that's sort of, it's why we sort of did this study that we had. We saw that there were things at work that were frankly messing up our creative process and some of our feedback, and we needed to bring them to life for people. And we needed to chop down this tree so the elephant could be seen. And that's really sort of what we're trying to do and what we'll show you. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a quick background, and you can kind of see the kind of different groups that we tested come to life. So if we could, let's roll the clip.
And neuromarketing, quite simply, is the application of neuroscience to marketing questions.
We actually just use the best tools for the job. So when we need to measure emotion, we use physiology. It's the most direct place to measure the emotion. When we want to understand attention, we use eye tracking. And when we want to understand cognition, we'll ask questions. Honda thought it would be a really fascinating study and useful for everyone if we can bring both dealers and people in the market for vehicles in to watch some television.
My name is Devin Sullivan. I'm the general manager right now of Dover Auto World.
I work for Gallery Automotive Group.
My father started the business back in 1979.
I am the 3rd generation. My grandfather started it in 1953. I've had the Honda franchise since 1995.
We came here, we get separated into some groups.
We have basically 3 groups. We have an eye tracking, the biometric testing, and then we have the input session here, and you'll all be kind of rotating through those.
Good luck. It doesn't hurt that much.
Just give some mild electric shocks. It won't.
It's a bit of surprise. I was expecting a normal dealer meetings. I was not expecting this kind of interactive meeting.
One of the great opportunities that Interscope has for its clients is to say, look, for years you've been relying on your eyes and your gut to evaluate your messaging and communication. What if we were able to bring you the eyes and the gut of your audience?
My name's Tony Almeida, and I'm a construction worker.
I'm Kelly Verrill, and I'm a systems manager.
I'm in finance.
I work at a commercial real estate company.
I am a teacher.
An educational consultant.
Executive assistant.
I work for a towing company.
Reason for the test was that very often it's hard to separate yourself from the thing that you work in every day. When someone is close to something, it changes the way that they emotionally react to it. A Honda dealer looking at a Honda ad has a very strong relationship to that ad, and the person who's in the market for Honda has a stronger relationship to that ad. So any difference between the groups we'll be able to see because they were in the same environment, and also we were studying them unconsciously.
All right, so here are the sort of key things you need to know about what we're about to show you. So we've got two groups that we tested, right? One group are dealers, but these aren't just any dealers. These are people who are advertising clients, right? These people sit on advisory boards. These are creative decision makers. And then on the other side, we have their audience, people who are in market for a car right now, the target audience, non-avoiders of Japanese vehicles. This is who this group is trying to talk to. And wherever possible, we tried to make sure they did not know the purpose of the study. So it's a blind test to the best degree that we could make it. In terms of what we showed them Honda ads, competitor ads, and other ads. So Honda, which they should have a strong relationship to, competitor ads, Toyota, Nissan, Ford, etc., and then random other ads, Tide, Coors, etc. And we did it all in a natural context. All everybody did was sit down and watch an hour of television that is exactly like the TV at home, regular commercial breaks. We basically showed the same program, same ads, same order, same environment. We got rid of as much research bias as we possibly could. And it just seemed appropriate to throw in a Batman Begins reference because we're in Chicago where it was all filmed.
So what did we find? So you can imagine going into this, we had a hypothesis, and that hypothesis or idea was that we would be able to measure this bias, that the dealers, because of their expertise and their knowledge and working in this industry every day, might actually experience their own ads differently than their target auto shoppers. So let me show you a little bit of the results. We're going to be using correlations as a measure of an effect size, which basically means, for those of you who don't look at correlations every day, 1 plus 1 is a perfect correlation. That means every single signal we measure was exactly the same in the two groups. It's very, very hard to achieve a 1. Anything over sort of 0.5 is considered significant. And then you can have a -1, which is a perfectly negative correlation, which means literally as one group is going up, the other one is going down simultaneously at the same time. So when we looked at the program as a whole, and we just sort of used standard comedy and something that people could easily relate to, when we looked at the correlation between the eye tracking and the biometrics between the dealers and the auto shoppers, we saw about a 0.6 correlation. Actually, it was close to 0.7. So that's pretty good. So they're experiencing that program content in a similar way. When we looked at the non-vehicle ads, things like Old Spice and Clorox, the correlation dropped a little bit. These are advertising executives after all. We've done other studies that show there's some biases there.
And that different looking groups.
But that correlation is actually still pretty high. It's about 0.45. And when we look at the competitive brand ads, so now we're moving into the auto category, but not the Honda ads, it was actually quite consistent. So these dealers are experiencing competitive ads similarly as they're experiencing non-vehicle ads. But the test was really about how they experienced Honda ads. And what you're looking at, by the way, is a measure of visual attention. So we're using eye tracking, and so we're literally correlating where the eyes of the dealers are going versus where the eyes of their target audience is going. And that correlation dropped to near 0, almost 0.1. Suggesting no relationship between these two audiences and how they're visually consuming their Honda ads. When we then switch to the biometrics, which is a non-conscious measure of emotional processing, we see a similar pattern. The correlation to the content was about 0.6. When you look at the correlation to the non-vehicle ads, it's about 0.45. When you look at the non-Honda ads, it's about 0.43. And once again, when we get to the Honda ads, it drops to 0. It's actually slightly negative, which means there are moments when their target audience are going up and the dealers are actually going down.
So let's look at it now for the fun part. Okay, so what are you going to look at? So on the y-axis going up, you've got the overall level of emotional engagement measured unconsciously. So this is our unconscious emotional engagement with the ad on a moment-by-moment basis, okay? And then you've got on the bottom, time. And then what you can see is this green line is shopper engagement. So that shopper group, how are they engaging moment by moment? And this blue line is our Honda dealers, how are they engaging? So let's watch the first part of the first ad. Okay. So what is happening right now, right? We have done our job. Success has been had. That green line is going good. We had a sort of a moment. It drops down as the beginning. That's normal. People trying to figure out what's going on. And then they see the story come to life. They're emotionally engaging. Things are looking good. And at the same time, our clients continue to drop. This is why I find gray hairs in my beard. Okay, so you are a smart audience. Can somebody tell me what it would take, because we see that that blue line starts to go up. What do we need to make that blue line go up? That's right.
It's the same, only different. The forever fuel efficient.
I'm glad you all guessed. Okay. And then, of course, there's one more element. As you can see, our shoppers are starting to level out, but we've done a good job. We've kept them engaged. But the dealers are going to find something even more interesting here.
Civic from Honda. For great leases and low financing, see your Honda dealer.
All right, let's watch one more.
Hey, buddy, what are those?
Your zeros.
What are they for?
They're for the thing. Really big thing?
Oh, right. The big thing. Where am I going to put them?
You can put them in front.
For the first time.
All right. So we did an interesting job here, but one of the things you can see is that right now the dealers are on the single highest increase in the entire hour of program that they watched. The single steepest increase is happening right now. Now, in fairness, this was a really big deal at the time. People had done 3 zeros before, but not 4. We're in good shape. They are dealers after all. They call them that for a reason.
Lease a Honda Insight for 0 down payment and 0 due at signing.
It's called the really big thing, only at your Honda.
Okay, so we introduced the topic of bias earlier, and I made a distinction between learned bias and innate bias. How many people think what you're seeing here is a learned bias? How many people think it's an innate bias? Okay, so those of you who raised your hand on a learned, I'm going to show you evidence that suggests that this is in fact a learned bias. People are not born highly engaged or wired to experience Honda ads differently than people who want to buy car ads. But this is actually I think some of the best evidence for that, right? So another bias that we see in advertising all the time with the eye tracking is called a facial bias. And what that basically means is if you put a face on a screen, people are going to look at it. And they will preferentially look at that face over any other information. The other known bias, and you all sort of know this, is that people seem to think that pets are cute, and so they tend to look at pets as well. And here we have a situation where we have a face, so this is the driver, and then we have a dog, which of course is cute. But we also have this cloud that's showing the car. And what I find interesting is that the shoppers are looking at the face. If you look closely, there's some eye tracking. That light green shows visual attention to the dog, who is looking away. The dog should be looking forward if you want attention on that face. Think pet food ad. And then they're also consuming the sort of fantasy car in this bubble. But when you look at the dealers on the left, you see almost 100% of them are looking at the car and ignoring that face. That's actually really hard to do. So they're clearly been wired and learned that this is something that's more important. We made some comments about the deal cards at the end. Here again, you're looking at eye tracking. The red dot suggests high visual attention, the yellow low visual attention. And what you're seeing here is that the shoppers on the bottom really aren't getting into the details very much. They're actually kind of just zoned out, staring at the center. And when we look at the dealers, they're actually trying to read the small text, which nobody actually reads. And then one final metric, again, sticking with eye tracking here, when you look across typical advertising and you do a very simple metric, which is just what is the percentage of the time the audience is actually looking at the screen, we tend to see a difference between shoppers and other ads. And on average, shoppers looking at advertising that's relevant to them will be between 75 and 90%. Our dealers are totally fixated on their ads, and they're clocking in at 97% of the time. They literally cannot take their eyes off of their own advertising.
And beats teenage video gamers playing their favorite games.
And finally, when we think about sort of the story elements and other pieces here, and we look at the order in which people engage and visually consume certain aspects of these advertisements, we see that the dealers are focused number 1 on the deal, number 2 on the car, number 3 on the story. And when we look at shoppers, that actually flips. They're more engaged with stories, the product second, and the deal third.
So we talked about the fact, right, that these shoppers and these dealers are engaged on both things, but when they look at the Honda ads, right, there's no relationship between what they're looking at, there's no relationship between what they're emotionally reacting to. And all those differences are going to affect their cognition. They're going to affect the kind of words that they use and how they react and what they remember. So the important thing here, so we're looking at the words to describe that big offer zeros ad that you saw, right? And so the good news here is that big, sale, special, we were just asking them, what's kind of the main message takeaway? The ad worked. It delivered the message. But then we started to see some differences. Dealers said great. Shopper said good. Dealer said funny. Shopper said blah. And dealer said urgency. And shopper said boring. So you come away with, yes, your main message got through, but you come away with some different words you would use to describe that. And then we'll talk about that t-shirts ad. Consistent and environmental, oh, so this is different, but then we look at the first 2 words. This sort of idea of environment over time really came through for both audiences. But then the shoppers say exciting, and dealers say good. Shoppers say cool, dealers say reliable. So they're in 2 very different emotional places, and that's coming out in the words they use about the advertising. So then at the very end, right, so we had these people in this natural context, right, and they are talking, they're just watching an hour of advertising. And we just asked them, hey, what ads do you remember? You just watch an hour of TV with a whole bunch of ads in, and dealers remembered both ads about equally, about 20%. When that zeros ad comes up, 2%, just a couple of people remembered the zeros ad or were able to free recall it. The t-shirts ad, totally different. It broke through at a much higher rate than even the people for whom the advertising was for in the dealers, right? The advertising broke through in a way that's totally different. So on the whole, bias changes what you're going to emotionally react to. It changes literally what you see when you look at advertising, and then it affects your cognition, it affects the words you use, it affects what you remember. So that's cheery.
Right, so Rich and I were a little nervous that we're standing up here making the case that all of you are experts in something, And if you are an expert in something, that means you're biased. And so you all carry an expert bias at some level. And we didn't want to end there.
No.
And we wanted to sort of end on a positive note, which is the same scientists and academics who discovered that these biases exist have now pivoted to try to understand, well, what can we do about them? And so there are programs, for example, with race, where there are towns in certain areas of geography where interventions are being made with small children to introduce them to multiple racial profiles and positive attributes to them in an effort to sort of preempt racism. I'm going to give you an example of a different one. And here we have, which might be particularly relevant given the history of the 3% conference, a known sort of bias that women, despite being better at math or comparable at math as men or boys, tend to underperform in under-testing conditions. And so there were some folks who really wanted to go after this, and they created essentially a study where all they did, it's the same math test based on the SAT, and all they did was adjust how they framed the math test that men and women or boys and girls took in this case. In the first condition, they framed it as a game. It's just a game, just for fun, do the best you can. And when you do that, we see that men and women are actually quite comparable. In fact, women outperform men as other studies have shown. In the second condition, the test was framed as diagnostic of your math skills. And when you frame it as diagnostic of math skills, we see that the bias kicks in and the women's performance drops incredibly. So the question became, is there another way that we can frame this for academics? Because I don't think we can convince university professors to say, oh, it's just a game, don't worry about the test. But could we do a different intervention? And there's some studies starting to show that by essentially using a certain framing, you can actually inoculate against the bias. In this case, the teaching intervention was quite simple. In the instructions, they said this is in fact a diagnostic test of your skills. Keep in mind, sometimes people get anxious before a test, and that anxiety has nothing to do with your actual skills. Good luck in the test. And when you do that, we see that the levels go back to near parity. So there is some hope when we think about these things.
Thankfully.
So what we're doing here with these so-called inoculations and framing effects is really trying to invoke and talk to the rider instead of the elephant in a hope of kind of minimizing that bias. And our hope today is that merely by being in the audience and listening to us talk about this and introducing this topic, that you will have taken your first step in understanding your own expert bias and beginning to sort of think about this as you go out into the world.
Because the good news is, once you're sort of inoculated against it, you have a higher likelihood of being able to recognize it in others. This is a really simple piece of wisdom that I received when I was starting out my career, which is the basic idea that if you've got two people that are super far apart on an issue, all you can do is shout at one another, right? And so, when we think about what to do in these situations practically, you have the situation where you need to figure out how to close the gap, right? When somebody comes up with these biases that seem very difficult to overcome. So how do we do that? There's sort of three different kind of ways we think of to really attack this. The first is listening and, to a degree, empathy, right? If somebody is out there and they've got this bias, you need to figure out what that bias is. What is it that behind the wall? What is unsaid? I mean, to a certain degree, look, I poked a little bit of fun, somewhat at the dealer's expense earlier. But in fairness to them, they have millions upon millions of dollars of inventory of cars on their lot. And they are paying a percentage for every day that those cars are on their lot, right? And their success, how much they're paid, and whether or not their kids go to state school or private school is dependent on how many cars they move off that lot, right? So yes, they're completely invested, and they're not emotionally reacting like a normal person, but that's also kind of for a relatively reasonable reason. That's sort of the first step, is you need to get to figure out what that is with your audience. The second part is you got to figure out how to find common ground. If you have a client that's all about profit, right, then you need to figure out how you can be all about profit too, and then explain how what you're doing feeds that. Which then brings me to my third thing, which is about preemption. And as a bunch of creative directors in the room, I would argue that this is a place where your planner should help you. You should know, the client, and then setting up the work, right, can be so critically important, which is something we all know. But another way to think about that setup is, how do you take away the biases? How do you knock down the concerns or start to tell people how they're going to be addressed by the creative they're going to see before they see it? We talked about inoculation as a way to sort of overcome. How do you inoculate your audience to a certain degree before they go through this process of seeing your creative? And so with that said, if there are any questions, we have time. Up here in the front.
Hi.
Hi.
Did you actually show these results to the dealers, and did that change their process?
Yes, we did. Sometimes is the answer to that question. We got, as I think you might expect, both a mix of positive response, particularly from younger people, I think probably whose bias hadn't been built up over time, and probably saw a sort of need to change in the industry or think a little bit differently. And then there were also some people who were, don't confuse. There was one person who said, "Don't confuse your conclusions with the facts." My personal favorite response ever, right? Brutal. So yeah, look, we got both reactions. I think probably the bigger thing is that it also inoculates everybody who works on that piece of business, right? Because there's an acknowledgement of what it is that they react to, what they care about, and then how do we sort of strike the balance between keeping a stakeholder engaged and happy while also providing creative that really accomplishes its mission.
And if I could add to that, to be fair, these biases aren't learned overnight, right? They're sort of accumulate over time. And I think we probably were overly ambitious to think one study was going to erase these expert bias. But we did go on and do a series of other studies where we would use metrics like these that have a lot of science behind them to educate over and over again about some of the differences that they're seeing in creative. And what we know works in market sometimes goes against their intuitions. And I think we've made some progress.
Yeah, and we've, I think, chipped away at that continually over time. Other questions?
Back here?
I think our other cube is still out of action from the beginning.
Can you stand up, please, whoever had the questions? Yeah. We want to move to the middle of... Sorry to make you exercise. Speaking of exercise, nice job.
You may not have an answer for this, but I'm curious if you have any examples of best practices around neuroscience and how best practices around communicating or advertising a service versus a product.
It's a good question. So we get questions all the time about, my category is different. So financial services as an example versus, say, consumer packaged goods versus, say, entertainment, think Hollywood movie trailers. And our database now is large enough, just to give you a benchmark, last year we tested over 50,000 people on thousands of ads. So we have accumulated knowledge. And when you look at the differences within a category versus the differences across a category. So if you look within the service industry at a really good ad versus an ad that's not very good, and you look, say, in consumer packaged goods at a really good ad and one that's not very good, the differences within the category are much, much, much larger than between categories. And so what we've learned, again, from a neuroscience perspective, is that people tend to engage with common themes, right? So stories, that have a clear beginning, middle, and end, with relatable characters that take them on a journey, that integrates the brand, product, and services in a very clear way, and has an emotional payoff, tend to work regardless of the category you're advertising in. Now, within that, there's all kind of strategies and planning, which is where you all come in. We just sort of test whether or not each of those elements are working, but hopefully that gives you a sense for the question. Thank you. I think we're out of time, so thank you for your attention. Hopefully you learned a little something about expert bias.
Thank you.